Existential Comics is known primarily, I think, for the comic strip, which you can find online. I'll put a link to it below. But they had something really quite funny that drew a lot of discussion in Twitter recently. And so here is the tweet. I'm going to give it to you, and then I'm going to make a few provisos myself, and then we'll launch into looking at what people had to say about it. So here's how it goes. Conservative men think that they are less emotional, in quotes, because they don't count, in quotes, being a huge whiny baby about literally everything as an emotion. And as you can see, it's been fairly recently tweeted out there, and it got a lot of views, not least because it's a huge account and quite a few people had something to say. Now, before we look at what people did respond or quote as responses to this, I do want to say something about the word conservative here. You notice that I actually put conservative in quote in the title of this, and that's because what counts as conservative in America in 2025 is not really conservative in older senses. I sometimes joke that conservatives have not managed to conserve conservatism because there's so many things where you can look at where people who describe themselves as conservatives were 40 years ago, 30 years ago, long before the Tea Party, long before the MAGA movement, long before the alt-right, and all these sorts of things, that there's a transformation that has taken place. So conservative has become kind of an ambiguous term, but we know who we're talking about here, I think, and so we can now launch into looking at what people had to say. So a lot of good responses here that have to do with, we could call it emotional intelligence and regulation, being able to understand your emotions and all that. So I'm going to read some of these that all have a common theme. The world's most emotionally dysregulated individuals somehow persuading themselves they are logic machines is actually not surprising at all, given how neuroses work. They think being emotionally repressed, having no emotional skills, and being unaware of your own emotions is the same thing as not having emotions at all. I know from personal experience. They also believe their whining is justified by rational thought. They don't acknowledge their own emotions, so they believe the only thing that can explain their anger at the situation, which we're going to come back to in a bit, is logic and not an actual emotion. Conservatives function on emotional repression, even though they say facts don't care about your feelings. You can clearly tell they don't have control of their emotions. Instead, they repress them. Conservatives shroud their emotions behind layers of logic and don't understand why to the rest of us the resulting, quote, logic isn't negated by the emotions or faith at the core of their ideology. And then finally, kind of a funny quip, they don't even know what emotions are because their dads told them emotions are gay. So we have one set of responses here with a common theme. People who call themselves conservatives, mostly men, don't really understand emotions well. Why? We could speculate about that. But what they do like to make appeals to is logic, rationality, all these other things as kind of a blind. And there's nothing so irrational as rationality merely in the service of the passions, we might say. Here's some other responses that are kind of in the same vein. They think all of their outbursts are justified and everyone else's are being a snowflake, so they project the emotionality onto other people. Just bottle down your emotions until they explode. Emotions are the only manly way to express yourself. Now we start getting to the crux of the issue. We're talking about explosions. We're talking about outbursts. We're talking about not being able to keep it all repressed or bottled up, right? I punch the wall when my sports team loses as an act of pure reason and intellect, playing off of that, I'm not the emotional one thing. And then finally, it's not being emotional if you don't cry while you're beating the crap out of your family. And that one's taking a darker turn, but, people who do terrible violence often don't acknowledge that it is coming from their emotions, right? Then we can talk about, well, maybe they do do acknowledge some emotions as being okay, but they often present them as not being emotions. So they somehow don't count anger either. They don't see anger as an emotion. It's more of an entitlement, unless women are angry and then it's bitchiness, right? So double standard there. I think it's because a lot of insecure men think anger is an acceptable man emotion instead of having a broad spectrum of emotions. Emotional to them almost always translates to vulnerable and genuine, whereas anger and frustration and intolerance are simply manly because they're emotions that don't show that vulnerability that comes with sadness or fear or whatever. And we'll come back to that in a moment. I actually wrote in and said that they don't acknowledge the whole anger spectrum from irritation and frustration to full-blown homicidal rage. Another person, rage and anger are emotions. They are the most emotional. And in a way, this kind of jibes with what, for example, Seneca has to say. What they unironically do is mentally retcon getting constantly triggered by everything as some sort of justifiable anger so they can pretend that they are being emotional. Probably means to say they're not being emotional. And there's other emotions that these guys display as well. Emotional is when you talk about your feelings. Manly is when you're afraid of going to Times Square and you get really nervous if you don't know what kind of oil was used for your French fries. I mean, that's kind of interesting, right? Because most conservative men back in the 80s would not be worried about what kind of oil was used for their French fries, but there's so many out there that are like, it's going to affect my masculinity, and they're all worried about that, so they better make sure that it's not seed oils, oh my God, right? That sort of thing. Literally will cry like the victims they claim others to be when a race swap from their favorite TV show happens, or gaming, or movies, pick whatever you like. Yeah, they can be crybabies. Dennis Prager, who's a conservative radio show host who's really taken like a crazy turn in the last couple decades. He was at one time kind of a rational person, but he hasn't been for quite a while, is the example of this. Spends half his show complaining about how emotional women are and the other half crying about how he couldn't go out to eat during COVID. And so, there's other emotions, fear, sadness, disappointment. They do feel emotions. They just don't want to acknowledge them. Now, the conservatives got to have a little response. Some of them weighed in. These are some of the more interesting ones. Yes, watching perpetual leftist psychopathy and pushing back against it isn't an emotion. It's a chore you people subject us all to. I mean, it's kind of telling, isn't it, that somebody would actually write that? What a victim. Liberal men think they're more employed because they don't count panhandling and soliciting money from strangers on social media as being a bum. So this is an attack against Existential Comics, who does in fact, get donations from people who like his comics. I don't think that's restricted just to liberals. I think perhaps there might be conservatives who also use things like GoFundMe or PayPal or Patreon or whatever, but well, that's a separate issue. Another sort of gotcha. You guys are the same, LOL. I mean, that's not much of a response. Here's some funnier ones. Right-wing emotion is lion-coded. Well, left-wing emotion is small dog-coded. So they're acknowledging that emotions are involved there, but they want to say lion-coded because everybody's got to be a lion. When you actually look at a lot of these guys, they do remind you of small dogs. And then finally, a guy who's just not going to play your game. I have plenty of emotions. I'm a man. You don't need to see my emotions. The people close to me see them. I'm not a drama queen. I gotta laugh because I suspect, yes, indeed, he might be a drama queen. All right, and then here's one that was really over the top. is this where you tell them they should take their own lives because it'd make you feel good? There's this like trope out there now of conservatives claiming that they're being told that there's no room for them. They should kill themselves and everybody wants them to die. So there were some good responses to this one. How does stop being a dick to women and minorities translate to take your own life? Then if it was, I think it would have been at the end of the tweet. Did you see it there? Are you here to whine about something you made up? And then there were two others that conveyed a different sentiment. We wish you could just be happy with being the richest and most powerful people on the planet instead of making that everyone else's problem. Or, oh my God, project much? I'd very much like conservatives to live long, happy, healthy lives. I'd also like them to leave everyone else alone so they can do the same. And then finally, is this you being a whiny bitch about everything? And the answer to that is yes, self-evidently that is the case. And then we got another one that is worth looking at just by itself. It's pretty performative, I'm going to say, not using that in the sense of posturing, but rather it's a libertarian who's libertarianing, right? It's almost like the person turned himself into a trope. As a libertarian, I am ambivalent about your attack on conservative men, but I do want to point out that being a huge whiny baby about literally everything is an action, not an emotion. You can almost hear the sort of dorkiness and the pedantry underlying this, right? I mean, obviously being a huge whiny baby is not an emotion. It isn't actually an action either. If we want to be very technical, it's an attitude, and it does come from emotions. So, I mean, I'm not going to say all libertarians are like this, but it is kind of characteristically libertarian. Finally, here's a funny one. That's a picture of Michel Foucault, of course. People merely function in different epistemic systems, explaining what counts as emotional. What is happening is different epistemic systems fighting for dominance. Now, that isn't actually something Foucault would say, you know. So this is somebody who I think perhaps doesn't know Foucault all that well, but it's an attempt to sort of relativize this and say, oh, can't we all get along, or different strokes for different folks and all that. And no, we do live in an era where there are a lot of people calling themselves conservatives. Like I've said, they're not really conservatives. There's something different now. And there's a lot of petulance and self-indulgence and projecting things onto other people. And they have very, very thin skins. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of them raging or whining in response to this video, as they are indeed to Corey's Existential Comics original tweet. So there we have it. You can weigh in with your own views on this. I think that this is very funny, and I thought it would be worth sharing with you, but there's also a not so humorous side to it. It's some pretty good social commentary that evoked some interesting responses, some of which are continuing social commentary, some of which are embodying exactly what is being discussed in this. So that's it for this one.